Okay, hello. This is Dan Neely. I'm the CEO and founder of Networked Insights. Today we're joined by Sean from Forrester, who's going to take us through some insights from their organization and share more on the topic for today. Sean, I'm going to pass it over to you, and we've got about an hour today. Like I said, Sean's going to share some things. I am as well, and then we'll go from there. So, Sean, you're all set to go.
Great. So, again, here to talk about infusing media planning with social data. So, to get started, we're going to bring you through some of the landscape. I know some of this information I'm going to show you up front here is very high-level landscape data, and you pretty much have to be living on the moon with your head buried in the sand not to know some of it. But I always think that the data shows a great story and really kind of turns your head when you actually see it up front. So with that, I'm going to start with something really high-level, and that is Internet penetration and the growth over time. So I think we all know at this stage that the Internet has grown pretty dramatically. There are over 1.6 billion people online across the world. But what's interesting now is it's actually still growing dramatically. It just isn't happening in places like the U.S. As you can see in that chart, the U.S. is pretty much flatlined. Same thing's happening in most countries in Western Europe. However, it's the BRIC countries, countries like Brazil, Russia, India, and China that are still driving a lot of the change. And those countries will actually represent 1/3 of the online population by 2014. So I think it's always good to keep in mind that this is still a growing world, still a lot of data out there to take advantage of. And at the U.S., we've really hit that penetration level. Of course, mobile is in a similar situation. Right now in the U.S., mobile penetration among U.S. adults is at about 80%, very similar to the U.S. So if you look at the world now and see some of this data that I put in front of you, you're looking at PCs, laptops, video game consoles, DVR through TV, satellite radio, et cetera. What you have here is just a world that's not just based on the Internet, but really the digital world that we're living in. And as you look at some of the other changes in this space, specifically with the mobile phone, I think it tells an interesting story. I think we all know at this point the smartphone is making some significant changes. The data I'm showing you here in that first bullet, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults own a smartphone. It's a little bit of an older piece of data for us. It's from earlier last year. So I put in the Nielsen data there because I think that really tells the story of what's happening today, which Nielsen predicting that more Americans own smartphones than your typical feature phone by Q3 of this year. So it's really mobile phones and smartphones specifically are really becoming the actual phone for people. So you're really walking around with a computer in your pocket. And if you look at some of the other data around this, 1 out of 4 U.S. adults having an unlimited data plan. Of course, Apple selling its 10 billionth app in January. I don't think I need to get into the app conversation with people today. We know that this space is growing dramatically. Of course, this is happening globally as well. You look at places like Japan and China, the mobile phone is an intricate part of the way people connect. India, the same thing. In fact, the United Nations did a study just about a year and a half ago and found that in India, more people have access to mobile phones than they do toilets. So clearly the mobile phone has become the way that many people connect through the globe. And of course, there are new devices as well. The tablet, the iPhone, the Apple iPad, for instance, has really created this new device, which is a bit of a hybrid between our mobile devices and our PCs and laptops. And Forrester predicts by 2015 that 82 million U.S. adults will own a tablet PC. So you can see that tremendous growth in that red line and the sales and the users. So clearly, tremendous growth in this new type of device as well. And then if you look to even our traditional media, the big daddy of TV. We are predicting that by 2015, if you see that red line kind of curving up, that's the number of households, or percentage of households actually, with what we call a connected television. Connected TV, and if you've seen them, Samsung, Sony, several other brands have come out with some new televisions that are essentially connected, allow you to connect directly to the Internet. Now, we've been predicting in the industry for maybe a dozen years at least that television is going to go interactive. But clearly, we actually think that this is going to happen now. One of the data points that can help bring to the forefront here is that if you look at U.S. online adults and you look at this number that 1 in 4 are watching full-length TV shows online each month, it shows that there is a hunger for cross-device media consumption. So we do believe that the television is, now that it's being delivered in the U.S. on a digital platform, will definitely go digital and become more interactive. And of course, you have social media. Now, Forrester defines social media as something is fairly broad. It's not just social networks such as Facebook or MySpace, et cetera. In fact, we define it a little bit more broadly, including things like blogging, commenting on blogs, doing ratings and reviews, getting involved in discussion groups, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, if you use that definition, we see that more than 4 out of 5 U.S. online adults participate in social media each month. It's actually about 83% in our latest survey. So it's almost impossible to avoid social media at this point. And this is a global trend as well. So if you look at the European data now, mostly Western European countries in this survey, but 7 in 10 online adults in Europe also doing that. Of course, you get into the social network conversation. I think many of you probably know that Facebook has about 600 million users globally. That's close to 10% of the world's population, and the fact that they're blocked in mainland China shows how deeply penetrated they are across the world. If we look at the U.S., we see about 6 in 10 U.S. online adults are visiting social networks at least one time per month. Most of that was fueled by Facebook. We would include Twitter and some other social networks in here as well. And again, this is a global phenomenon where, like I said, that Facebook's mostly blocked in China, and you're still seeing 1 out of 2 online metro Chinese adults too. Quick backup on the data there. It's very difficult to survey people in China, especially in very rural areas, so we basically focus on the metro Chinese. But again, when you look at sites like renren.com in China, those are the types of sites that are driving a lot of the interaction for Chinese on the social network side. But most importantly, we want to look at the activity that these people are doing. So people are very active with social media. So one of the things that we added to our behavioral set in this past year is what we call the conversationalist. And what that means is someone that's posting a status update on a social site such as Twitter or Facebook on a weekly basis. So most of this data I've been showing you is actually monthly data. So this is actually weekly data. And then we're seeing nearly 1/3 of U.S. online adults are posting updates at least weekly. That shows you how much, just think about how much data that's creating, how much conversation that's creating in the social space. You can figure out why people are talking about this so much. We don't have a global stat here if you're waiting for a second line. There actually isn't one. It's a brand new stat for us, so I think we'll have some of that information in the future. And of course, I've been talking mostly adults at this point, which is an 18+ set. Oops, I jumped ahead a little bit. Giving away the secret sauce. When you look at millennials, which typically are defined, Gen Y is pretty much defined as people born 1980 or after, you start to see their numbers in the digital space are just through the roof. You look at like the third bullet down, for instance, 57% of 100+ friends on Facebook. You look at how often they're accessing the mobile internet. Over half of them are doing that on a weekly basis, and how many of them have gaming consoles. A very digital group. And on top of that, the thing that I think is most interesting about this group is they're actually, if they're born in 1980 and after, they're actually probably a little older than you might think. So if you think about someone born in 1980, they just turned 30 this past year. 40 million of them have entered the workforce in the past year. So what this means is you have a very empowered customer. And I already showed you my cheap plug, which I'll jump ahead to right now. So I don't know how many of you read The Groundswell. It's a pretty popular book that Forrester published a couple of years back. The idea behind The Groundswell is just showing you all this data and showing you how people are using social technologies to change the way they behave with their lives. But now we actually just wrote another book called Empowered, because right now we're saying at the end of the day, now that your customer, your consumer as a company has become empowered through The Groundswell, now you must start to use these technologies through your employees to help solve their problems. When you think about marketing in that sense, as I transition from data into talking about marketing a little bit, all of a sudden this toolbox we've had in terms of marketing our skill sets for some time doesn't really make so much sense. In fact, if you actually look at even our language in marketing, and I don't know if you've heard the analogy, it's been a pretty popular one that's been told over the last few years. Marketing is very militaristic in its approach. If you think about the language again, it's campaigns, strategies, tactics, even targeting our customer. So in a lot of ways, if you think about our mindset, it's almost been kind of this Rambo approach. It's we're out to kind of kill our customer. But you really can't take this approach anymore. I mean, in a lot of ways, our customers is shooting back. Typically, like to say the deer have guns. In this case, I only found a squirrel. But the hunters, in many ways, have become the hunted, and the way we have to have a conversation here on a one-by-one basis is very different than that mass approach. So we believe at Forrester there's a new era of marketing upon us. We basically called the last decade the Internet era. In the Internet era, there was a separate online thing that each marketing department had, whether it's a web team, e-commerce team, internet marketing, or digital marketing team, very isolated and separated from the rest of the group in most cases. Now we're starting to see, because of all these different technologies kind of infiltrating their way into even our traditional media and creating new devices, new opportunities, really living in a digital world that all marketing must be digital. So that vertical of interactive almost needs to go away. Sure, there are going to be specialists, but in many ways that needs to go away. So what is the era of adaptive marketing? really what it comes down to is this kind of always-on flexible approach. You've heard the words agile, I'm sure, or iterative. It's very much that idea that you're living in an always-on world, providing constant conversation, constant data to you, and marketers must be more flexible and reactive, almost like a political campaign. You're going in with a small group of people or a large group of people trying to always kind of pull levers across grassroots, media planning and buying, public relations, customer service in some ways. So you're kind of pulling all these levers at the same time across the board rather than isolating into different silos. To give you a sense of some of the change in this era, the focus shifts from push to pull. There will always be push marketing. I'm going to actually make the point right now that I am not one of those people that is predicting the death of advertising, not in any stretch. I actually strongly believe that advertising will be a great tool for marketers moving forward. And I'm going to get into a little bit of that in a minute. But the focus overall really is about finding these customers that are speaking loudly, creating a lot of that word of mouth online, and then pulling them in. The groundswell of social media is mainstream. I think from the data we just saw, we're pretty much at that point. Marketing communication is always on. I don't think we're here yet with this. In some cases, some teams like PR, customer service, even parts of interactive marketing or e-commerce, e-business, whatever you want to call it, have been always on. But not all marketing is, and I think the bulk of budget we still see are very much tied to campaigns. You still have a lot of Gantt charts and spreadsheets that are showing how we're going to go out and push out our marketing to folks over time, and I think that needs to change. We need to have this always-on kind of lifespan that's just continually moving and changing and optimizing. Customers move from passive audience to active participants. You think about the terms, again, audience, it's about someone sitting down, listening, and engaged. I would say that most advertising audiences are not that, but they are active participants now, so I think we actually need to start thinking about people in a different way. Budgets will continue to shift towards digital. I'm going to show you a little bit more of that data momentarily. And finally, and probably most importantly, intelligence is going to just drive decisions in, I would say, near real time. We're at this point in a lot of digital marketing, but not in the rest of our marketing. I think we'll see as more and more data comes in from the digital space, specifically through social media, we're going to find that intelligence is really going to drive a lot of our decisions. And I want to back up and just say one more thing before I move on to the next slide. Intelligence is a term that I'm going to just define really quickly because traditionally our market research and intelligence has been more real-time, more linear, in which we did market research up front and then we did analytics on the back end. We really need to have more of that kind of feedback loop with those things kind of combined in the future, which I think is almost an adjustment for most marketers and their agencies moving forward. So I think you'll start to see that the word intelligence, or at least the idea behind having this always-on kind of brain, is the way that we're going to have, we're going to approach analytics and research in the future. And just trying to move the slide. Bear with me as the slide moves. Yep. And we jumped way ahead. My apologies. Okay. So as we look at media, the media mix moving forward, and I kind of already gave it away a little bit, and here I'm using the term bot media, and I think you'll see paid and bot are often used interchangeably. We actually see the world in three groups: earned, owned, and paid media. Three very slow groups. Paid media or bot media has been the cornerstone of our media mix for a long time now. Sure, we had customer service, sure, we had PR, even things like search marketing or kind of these always on, like SEO is always on type communication. But at the end of the day, it's been the cornerstones where we spend literally hundreds of billions of dollars each year across the globe. I see the role of that changing, and we see that changing in general from still not being the cornerstone, but still being very important, more as a catalyst to drive conversation forward in the future. Then there's the idea of owned media. Very simple. Your website, for instance, in the digital space has been your own media for a long time as a brand. However, now you can have several moons with that. You can have a Facebook page. You can have Twitter accounts. You can always have microsites. So there's ways, YouTube channels, et cetera, et cetera. So there's ways to have several different places to live online. And really, for marketers, that's a big opportunity because most marketers have had to rely on advertising to reach most of their customers, whereas now they can actually build applications, build places where they can develop those longer-term relationships beyond the website. And finally is earned media, which is really interesting because it's the result of all the experiences that people are having and then the conversation that's taking place. It's all that word of mouth that's becoming published media through social platforms. So we see these kind of becoming the balance of media in the future, and we're seeing many interactive marketers, many brands now using this terminology. I did some research on this a couple of years back, put some definitions behind these terms because I found a lot of people were using them, and I kind of attributed the earliest company we've seen using this is Nokia, and since then I've seen at least 20 different companies using it. Bear with me as the slide changes. So we actually believe the transition towards earned, owned, and paid as a balance of media has already begun. Apologize again for jumping ahead. I'm going to jump back to this. This is our forecast at Forrester. In 2011, we're forecasting about $34 billion in the U.S. Online marketing spend. As you can see, most of that's in search and display. Search continues to grow tremendously. Coming out of the recession, it made a lot of sense for search. It was a very safe place for people to put their dollars. The display continues to grow as well. Things like mobile and social, we see them growing. Social is interesting because there's a lot of energy behind it, but there's not a lot of places to put dollars. It's not something you can easily buy your way into. It's not really the nature of it. So while we do see dollars moving in that direction, we really see that more around resources and other things. So there's definitely dollars moving in this direction, obviously. And then the next slide. It's a little bit older data. It's from a CMO survey we did in early 2009 at the peak of the recession, but I thought it still told a good story. It shows that marketers are really increasing, percentage-wise at least, in areas that we consider earned and owned media, mostly. So social media, website development, email marketing, are places that we believe are long-term assets that are building on their own rather than short-term campaigns. Now, of course, online advertising is sitting right there as number 3 with both a high increase and a fairly high decrease as well. But we see dollars moving in that direction too. So again, paid media not going away, it's still getting some growth, especially in the digital space. But again, the overall nature of the conversation we're hearing from marketers is definitely a shift in the balance towards earned and owned. Of course, there's a long way to go. Even when you take percentages away from things like TV, then there's several, at least in the U.S., something like $50 billion at least being spent there. A lot of shift and a lot of room to grow there. So just a quick example of some paid media. So in this case, you see Jim Beam. And what I think is different about this is they're actually using this as a catalyst to build content around Facebook or build activation and participation in their Facebook. So they're driving to a different type of owned media than normally. Normally they're driving to their website in this case, or a microsite. In this case, they're driving towards something else. So they're catalyzing that long-term relationship on Facebook. On the owned media side, the slide that's coming up might be a little bit slow. What we see here is that Best Buy is a brand that's done a great job with owned media. I'm going to hit the buttons here to build it out as soon as possible. But at the end of the day, what they've done is they have their website at the center of everything, which is still the most important thing that they have. But they also have top force on Twitter. So they can take their blue shirts and bring them out of the store and make them available to people on Twitter. They have their YouTube channel. They have a Facebook page with over 2 million fans or likers, whatever they're called these days. And they have applications on their mobile phones as well. So basically, Best Buy is living everywhere and building out experiences for people so they can touch them in every way in the digital space. And finally, there's the earned media part. And of course, this has had a lot of discussion around it, a lot of buzz. In fact, I don't know if you ever saw this map, but this chart I always really liked. It's from 2009, from June of 2009 through September of 2009. It's a Google News report, and what it shows is that 3 terms across Google News: Facebook, Twitter, and Iraq. So purple is Twitter, blue is Facebook, black is Iraq. The number of times those are mentioned in news articles across Google over that 3-month period. So we hear the idea of shiny object syndrome, where we get a lot of senior marketers or just about anybody calling us up saying, hey, we need help us build a Twitter strategy or help us build a Foursquare strategy. We try to poach from a different direction and say, you really need to start with people and objectives first. So there's a lot of that conversation going on, a lot of that really, people want to jump into the space. But for good reason, there is a lot of power behind this. So now we've talked about earned media is really the idea of word of mouth becoming public and becoming transparent to everyone, being easily accessed. And so we looked at the world and said, okay, well, if all this conversation is taking place, how much of it actually is being taken place from brands, from people to other people about brands? So in essence, how many can we actually create a number of impressions through research to say how many are word of mouth? And the number was pretty staggering. It's 500 billion in the U.S. in 2009. So in other words, across Facebook, Twitter, blogs, any type of social media platform, there were 500 billion times one person made an impression on other people for word of mouth about marketing. So that's a tremendous number. If you want something to benchmark that against, Nielsen said there were about 3.1 trillion online ad impressions in 2009. So about six times as many as the word of mouth. That word of mouth number is a high number of volumes. So there's a lot of conversation about brands being taken place out in the space today. The other aspect of this is it lives on. Google just recently changed its search engine results page to incorporate more social media. Google's really committed to social media. The reason Google search results love social media is it's very trusted. Google likes to provide the most relevant experience, and social content tends to be more trusted than other content. So here's a good example of a hotel I stayed at in London a couple months back. First page, two examples of TripAdvisor, which does a phenomenal job of getting its content in search engine natural listings, and then the reviews on Google itself. So some content there as well. And then now Google's starting different types of searches that you can do, whether it's on blogs, or in this case, this next example will be actually updates. So actually Twitter updates. So you can actually go onto Google and search what people are talking about on Twitter. I'm just waiting for that slide to pop up. And there it is. So what's important about this now is that if you look at the space in terms of overall media, even just paid media, for instance, that these have very close relationships that are known in paid media too. And in this case, I'm showing an example from our host at Network Insights, Best Buy's TV commercials. And what Network Insights did was, for all the Super Bowl commercials, take a look at what the actual lift in social conversation was from the week before the Super Bowl to the day of the Super Bowl and the day after. And in this case, for Best Buy, for instance, Best Buy, when they looked at volume, had one of the highest levels of conversation during the Super Bowl for that ad. I don't know if you remember the Ozzy and Justin Bieber commercial. And what they found was that about 60% of that conversation was positive in sentiment, and about 20% negative. So they had a lot of conversation that this ad is actually driving earned media. So that's what's happening, paid media driving earned media. And the 1.82 represents the lift from 1 week, the baseline, the week before of conversation that Best Buy had, to this 2-day period of the Super Bowl day and the day after. So what we're seeing here is that TV is creating a lot of conversation. Audi actually tried to take advantage of this. They actually put a hashtag into their television commercial. Hashtag was hashtag progress is, and got a lot of conversation just to kind of catalyze that. So I think we'll see more and more of that in the future, where we'll see a lot more of those catalysts actually be incorporated in the creative. So I'm just going to give you an example of Nike, for instance, is a brand that's done a great job of weaving all of these back together. So a lot of marketers have pulled them apart and said, what are the objectives and the strategies behind our own earned, owned, and paid media? But at the end of the day, they work best together, working together. So Nike did this great with their Right the Future campaign, which I heard them say was over 2 billion times. They had 2 billion impressions during the campaign across the world. So I don't know if you remember this commercial. It was about a 3-minute spot. And what Nike's doing, interestingly enough, these days is that they're taking their TV spots, and they're not creating 30 and 60-second spots, but then they change to digital. They're actually creating 3- or 4-minute videos or 2-minute videos. LeBron James, Tiger Woods, Right the Future for the World Cup. And then they're cutting it down to TV spots. So they're starting with digital and going to TV. So it's a different approach, and I think we're seeing more and more happen across the world. So what they did is they actually, in this campaign, had a lot of different things. They had their own media, such as their site, their earned media platforms, or their own media platforms creating earned media through community, Facebook, etc. A lot of conversation taking place. They really tried to create a lot of that conversation. What is the future? And that was part of it. So Write the Future was literally what they wanted you to do as an action, is to write what you think was going to happen at the World Cup. And as they collected all this conversation, collected this information, they actually used the earned media and then streamed it in paid media. They actually streamed it across a billboard, live stream in Johannesburg, during the World Cup. So you can actually see this billboard live, a digital billboard, streaming people's conversation about what they thought the future was. So that's a great example of a brand that's kind of ahead of the curve, taking earned media and putting it into paid media and kind of weaving it all together. So what's interesting today is that as you take all this earned media data, you see all this social conversation being created, there's actually some really interesting conversation out there, some really interesting data you can take advantage of. For this instance is really funny. It's a guy named Daniel Huffman who actually creates maps, and what he did is he went to Twitter's API and collected all the conversation from the U.S. in March and April. And during that time, what he did was actually look at how much profanity was being created in different regions. So in the dark spots on this map actually represent the lighter amount of profanity, and the lighter spots are the regions with the most profanity. So you can see, like around Atlanta, Georgia, there's just a lot of profanity, and kind of the areas of like such as Utah, where you might expect less profanity. I'm from Boston, and us in the Northeast, probably a little twisted, and probably wanted to see a lighter Northeast corridor, because that's just the way we are. But unfortunately, it was a little lower than I expected. But this just shows just someone being really creative with data and really creative with social data on this conversation. Now, grain of salt from someone from research, this isn't always going to be a great sample. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Depends how you use it. But at the end of the day, I think it's great. It can be great for a sample size. It cannot be. Sometimes it's directional, sometimes more quantitative. But at the end of the day, there's some great opportunities to use this and learn from it and optimize with it. As we look at media planning and how people plan media traditionally, I bought a lot of TV in my past, as well as a lot of digital as well. And you know, at the end of the day, the psychographics and even the demographics that we use really don't tell the whole story. So when we talk about men 18 to 34 with an interest in sports, might be ignoring what is the most important influence. Whereas, for instance, I might be really interested in sports and be more influential in the social space or in other places where people are listening to me through word of mouth, and therefore I should probably be taken a little bit more seriously than a friend of mine who likes sports but isn't that influential. Flip that around, and with cars, for instance, I might be men 18 to 34 with an interest in cars, but at the end of the day, I might not be that influential about cars. Whether I may have a friend or someone else, it's similar to me in demographics and psychographics that is influential. So on the left-hand side, you actually see a thing called clout. I don't know if you've heard it's gotten some press recently. It actually gives you a score based on your influence through Twitter. A little bit of a shiny object right now, but it gives you a good example of someone, again, being creative with social data and trying to determine if someone has a little bit more influence. This is what media planners are going to have to do in the future, is determine more than just someone's psychographics or demographics. That's really best for mass media. But at the end of the day, if you really want to be able to encourage sharing, catalyze that sharing, you have to really be able to discern between people's influence as well. So what does all this mean? At the end of the day, you know, we see this empowered customer. We see opportunities to use new data. But we have an uphill battle because our organizations, our skill sets, a lot of different things are not ready for this. So what should you do? Well, first, we need a mindset change. We say, ironically, traditional mass media ignores people's relationships with each other. And what we mean by that is they're ignoring that influence side. Need new roles. When we look at earned, owned, and paid and look at all the data conversation that's being created, some of it's customer service related, some of it's PR related, some of it's marketing related. So we really have to be able to work across teams and then create new roles. Kodak, for instance, has a chief listening officer now. It's a new role that they created. Skills. We talk about agencies and marketer skills today. Way too on the right brain, way too far to that. The pendulum has shifted all the way over there with television advertising and being kind of the cornerstone of a lot of what we do. Now we're seeing somewhat of a market correction there. You know, right brain's going away, but there's a swing towards the need for analytics and technology capabilities. Partners, specifically agencies, and specifically media planning and buying agencies. I worked at Cara for a long time. The people in those organizations are very intelligent, but at the end of the day, their business models are based on being paid on bought media. At the end of the day, they're getting revenue from companies, and they're incented to get companies to spend more on paid media. But at the end of the day, in this space, the best way to do is to balance all of media. So new skill sets are needed. We're seeing this across the agency space where PR folks are joining ad agencies. Interactive marketers are joining, or interactive agency folks are joining PR agencies, and vice versa. And we're seeing it across the board, just a kind of a shift in skill sets. And we see agencies that are competing more directly than ever before. So that idea of, this kind of idea of a great race that Forrester has talked about in the past is happening more and more with agencies, but they do need to adapt. And finally, tools. This kind of idea of intelligence in real time, including influence, helps build relationships between people. And that is where I'm going to transition now back to Dan, our host, to talk about network insights and some of the things they're doing with their tools and the intelligence that they can help you with your media planning.
Thanks so much, Sean. I'm going to take control back of on the keys here and keep us going. So Sean, certainly Sean gave us a great overview there. And is a great intro to some of the things we're going to talk about as far as how do we now, let's make this, how do we use this and how do we get some specific areas where we can focus on this being a component that we're interested in. So we're going to talk about 7 ways to inform your media planning using social data. And so the question comes, how do we use social data? How do we use this information as a better way or a more interesting way or a next layer of filter to in the context of a media plan? How can we use it as a predictive measure? How can we use it to pre-inform those activities which have gone into media planning in the past? How do we use it as a directional indicator? How can we use it to be indicative of the next thing that's going to happen? And because there is so much information out there in the social sphere, as we heard Sean talk about earlier, it's going to allow us to look at it and say, how can we find these trends and take advantage of them? So if we think about some macro trends, and certainly some of these were touched on earlier, but if we think about, in the context of the amount of time you and your organization spend on doing things, it's changed over the life cycle of business, at least in the last 15 years. So, in the old world, data gathering was the real strategic element. It was, how do I go out and en masse? How do I do 37,000 interviews so I can come up with a segmentation? We spent a ton of time in that space, and businesses were ultimately focused on the data gathering aspect, and it was highly strategic. The web then came along and completely flipped this curve, right? Data gathering was no longer took a lot of time. It was readily available. And so we saw that we were spending less time in that and more time in actionability. We saw, search come along and ultimately win. And, I would say Google is probably the champion in this space. They basically allowed us to access some cool stuff. You'd put a search into Google and something interesting would come up, and we'd be able to leverage and use that. Then what happened is the consumer web came along, and it completely flipped the curve again because there was an exponential growth of information and data being created by the customer. And so now all of a sudden when we go in and do searches on Google, it's just way more complex. We're not getting things back that are super valuable, or we've got to wade through it to get insight. So we went back into that data gathering proposition. Then what happened is we're now in a stage now. We're now in a stage where we're talking about the real-time web, and where we're talking about information flow, and ultimately it's flipped the curve once again in that we're not using it to search. We're not trying to find something. We're using it for discovery. So we flipped the curve in that it's no longer about data gathering. There are tools and technologies that are out there that are now trying to figure out how do we do this in that we're going to discover those trends. We're going to find those things. They're going to come to us, and fundamentally it's about contextual discovery. And that's where we are today. And so that's the core of what we do at Networked Insights, is discovering those things in this massive data set that we can leverage in that media plan to provide value to our businesses. So why is that important? Well, it's important because ultimately as a brand, you can't afford to outspend the ecosystem. You can't afford to outspend your competition. Pepsi and Coke, you can now afford to outspend each other on certain programs, but ultimately you can't afford to outspend an entire ecosystem that your consumer exists in. And so you have to figure out how to leverage this, the word of the web, the consumer, to make you more efficient, to make your set of dollars go even further, so you can keep your spend the same, but you can afford to spend the minimal effective amount. It's a phrase we like to use at Networked Insights. If we can get to the minimal effective amount, there is no waste in the system. And so how do we use all of this across our entire media spend, across earned, across owned, and paid, to ultimately provide a set of efficiency that's of high value, but potentially of low cost, and providing that set of efficiency over an extended period of time? So there are 7 ways that we'll talk about today that we've worked with our clients on using social information, on using our analytics platform, Social Sense, to provide that next layer of information, that next layer of insight, and that next layer of prescription around the media planning process. So the first, optimization of a current buy. You know, there are many shows out there that people are looking at. So Gossip Girl is a classic example. There's a slew of others of them. But Gossip Girl, it gets a 0.9 by Nielsen. And that's the currency in which you transact. That's the currency in which you buy this show. But in reality, there's a massive set of efficiency that's gained because you actually get an audience that's probably closer to a 5.4. And as a result, you're able to say, hey, you know what, this is kind of cool. I'm transacting based on the 0.9, so the show isn't costing me that much, but I'm able to get an audience that's much larger than that. Well, let's do that across the entire media plan. Let's find out where there are, where it's at, maybe the opposite, where you're paying on a 5.4, but in reality it's only a 3 when we look at it across social. You know, I think Sean mentioned before, 1 in 4 people are now watching a full-length show online, right? So they're consuming that content online. So let's find out what the spread and ripple is of those shows. Because let's be honest, still there is a large portion of the spend which is happening in TV. So let's make sure it works in the best way possible. I mean, you know, the example here for clients that we're able to get them, you know, 35% plus in efficiency across their buy becomes highly valuable. So the other is trying to find trends. You know, we predicted 2.5 Men being a big show, and that's obviously a topic of interest right now. But we predicted that a long time ago. We also predicted Modern Family being a big show. But finding those diamonds in the rough such that we can look at the trajectory of the audience and the growth of the audience in real time versus using a rear-view mirror approach. We can actually project how big we think an audience is going to be, and we can take advantage of that as a brand, right? We can use it to say, these are the leading indicators that say to me, this show is going to be big, all right? And I can lock in my rates early on. Maybe it's at the upfront, maybe it's in some other transaction that you have, or maybe it's that you decide to say, hey, you know what, the buzz around this show is something that is valuable to my brand. So therefore, let's identify which ones become, the most valuable to you and your audience. The next is audience segmentation. You know, we all remember the days, and I mentioned it earlier, 37,000 interviews. You know, companies like McKinsey and Booz Allen and Bain would come in and they'd say, 37,000 interviews, it's going to take 18 months, we're going to get to an answer, and you got to a great segmentation answer. The problem is it takes a long time. We need to get to dynamic segmentation, and we need to be able to map those segments to specific media opportunities. So now what we've got is we're actually able to go down a path of, hey, you know what? We know our brand, we know the segments, and we know the types of media they consume, we know where they consume them, we know which media properties they're going to, which TV shows they're buying into. So now all of a sudden we can actually use this information to say, hey, a new segment is forming, or a segment that I want to go after is now connecting to a new show, and we can do this in a real-time sensing approach versus it being something that is done once every 3 years, 5 years, and then mapped into a TV buy, which is done, you know, generally once a year. So being able to do that, you know, and then putting it all together, as we think about earned, owned, and paid, there's a lot to do with sequencing. There's a lot to do with how are we going to leverage social, how are we going to leverage PR events, how are we going to leverage our Facebook pages, how are we going to leverage, you know, those components that we put together. And so, hold on one sec. There we go. And so as we look at that, you know, we need to think about putting these things together. Say, okay, now I've got all of this, and I need to sequence it. Sequencing it in the right set of events in the right way is how to use social data. Because we see the trends so frequently, and we've seen so many of them over the 4+ years of data that we have, we can give a predictive element, say, here's how we think this is going to work, and ultimately use social as that leading indicator. So celebrity is always an interesting discussion. You know, many celebrities, the typical transaction is the brand or the agency comes up with a slate of professionals they believe are the celebrity endorser of choice. People look at things like Q scores and E scores, and they evaluate them, and then they go and have a conversation with management, typically the person that's responsible for that celebrity. But instead, imagine a world where we're no longer just using this, you know, the focus group approach, but we're actually using what the real consumer thinks about these celebrities, and we're also able to project how big this celebrity is going to be. What are they relevant around? What are they going to be bringing to us as a brand? And then you can go and have a conversation which says, here's your Q score, E score, or your social lift score that you have, and you know, here's what our brand has. Let's put those two together, and there's more value being created as a result of it. So now it not only allows us to evaluate which celebrity is most valuable to our brand, but it also allows us to say, how do we have a conversation that's not just about $5 million crossing the transom to go to celebrity? It's about creating value of the two brands together. And it's a new ecosystem for them as well, certainly as they think about building their own brands in this space. So number 6 is how we think about identifying the specific sets of content. Right, content acquisition is often very hard. Content creation is even harder. But as we think about the right types of content, now, imagine again this world where we're trying to figure out what is most valuable to our consumer. It's no longer about guessing, right? All of these things in the 5 previous and the one after this, it's all about, we're not thinking about gut-based decisions anymore. Sean earlier talked about the shift in mindset from the right-hand brain to the left-hand brain. The right-hand brain is a creative decision. It's typically been made on gut. The left-hand decision has always been made on data, and somewhere in between is going to be the right thing. So it isn't just about saying, hey, this piece of content is going to be great. It's going to be so creative. It's just going to be wonderful. No, it's about using data to back up your decision, or using data to inform your decision, because you're going to go through a set of processes where you say, hey, this piece of content sounds cool. I think it resonates with the brand, but how big is it ultimately going to be? How much value is this ultimately going to create? Because as it comes to putting that transaction in place, you have an ROI discussion on every single decision that you make. And this is one of the ways, again, that you can use social data. And then number 7 here is how do you figure out where to integrate your brand with a show. Example here is with Toyota and when they did their integration with The Walking Dead. And obviously creative was a highly relevant component here, but it also got brand lift for them. It allowed them to start thinking about what have we done with paid that is going to ultimately get us a component which is in earned, and also drive people back to our own destinations that they could push through series of names to a set of dealers. And we see that lift, right? We see that what happens when an ad like this really works. When we think about informing the right content, when we think about the right placements, when we think about the right set of segments that we're ultimately trying to target, and you're able to quantify very specifically the amount of value that was created, or the amount of savings that you're able to achieve overall. So before I go in here, another great example is certainly we're coming up to basketball. In the NCAA, there are many people that have decided to buy into the NCAA, and they bought at various levels. You've got a whole slew of them. They're spending anywhere from $40 to $50 million per tournament to get in there. Well, by using social, we're able to understand and uncover specific trends that are happening. So much so that now our clients are able to spend $2 million rather than $50 million to get the same type of awareness. And so when you're able to do things like that, it says that $48 million of what's being spent on the NCAA is above the minimal effective amount. Right? It's above the amount that we should be spending to get the right amount of awareness. And so that is ultimately what this is about. It's about no longer having the waste in the system so that we can continue to get efficiency out of the brand. So this is the piece that Sean talked about earlier with regards to Best Buy, and we talk about social lift. We talk about how much social conversation was created, but we also need to understand how much was spent in order to get that. So there's a return on investment that happens here. And so if you're someone like Chrysler who spent a lot more than everybody else, but you had the highest lift, it's that has a set of value, but per dollar that was spent on specific ads, Teleflora won, right? So they were able to get a greater set of lift out of their exposure on the Super Bowl. They ultimately got a higher ROI than everybody else in the system. So it allows us to think about it in that way. And so we'll, in a couple of weeks, we'll have another report coming out on the Oscars to think about how and what type of integrations make sense, what celebrities have value as we move forward. So as we think about it as a company, and Sean certainly talked about this, but the combination of these 3 things together, earned, owned, and paid, which are you going to use, which are you not going to use, when are they going to affect each other, and when are they not? It's no longer about a guessing game in these areas. We have enough data today, and we have enough trend analysis, and we have a powerful enough analytics suite to be able to say, these are the things that I know with a greater level of certainty are going to work. And we're able to show that they're working in with regards to return on investment. Because ultimately, when you walk into your CFO's office, that's what they care about, right? They care about getting what is the minimal effective amount we have to spend to get the right amount of awareness. And so leveraging these, you may leverage them in different ways. You may start with paid and then go to earned. You may start with owned and then go to paid. But ultimately, understanding how they interact with each other and the value they create with each other becomes really important. Sometimes it is the fact that you're going to go directly to your customers and leverage them as your suite of advocates. And you may say, hey, we only want advocates, so therefore we're going to go into the earned ecosystem to work with it. Or you may think about doing broad brushstrokes and say, hey, we're going to go after them, we're going to fill the top of the funnel, and so we're going to do something with our prospects. So networked insights, right? So we're using social information, we're using social analytics to figure out how to plan today $5 billion of media. So it's not a small number. There are plenty of companies that are doing this. We've taken it to a level where we can now inform that media plan across earned, across owned, across paid that says, hey, what are we doing in content or celebrity or media, both traditional and digital, and how do we think about informing what we're doing in our creative processes so that we can have a much more effective media plan. And that's fundamentally what we're doing as a company and as a business. So we have so you can certainly go to the URL to the bottom of the page here. But as you're thinking about media planning, right, we've got 5 tricks for media planning. It's an ebook that we've just come out with, and it certainly is. It has some of those tips and tricks that we've thought about, and our clients have thought about, and where they've seen high levels of ROI that they can leverage. And so that's certainly, if you go out to the bit.ly link at the bottom there, it's bit.ly/5tricks, and you'll be able to download a copy of that at that destination.